This video will not be about Meditation 5. The reason it won't be about Meditation 5 is Meditation 5 is a meditation mostly dedicated to proving that God exists a second time. But it's a really bad argument. I know I said in Meditation 3 that the argument Meditation 5 would be better. And it is. The argument, or rather the type of argument in Meditation 5 is better than the type of argument in Meditation 3, given what Descartes is trying to do. But Descartes' attempt at that argument, that kind of argument in Meditation 5, is so bad that I'm actually not going to cover Descartes' version. If this were a class about the history of modern philosophy or about Descartes in particular, we would go deep into what's going on here. But to the extent that you're interested in the issues, you're interested whether there is or could be a good proof of God's existence, you're interested if there's a way out of the kind of skepticism Descartes brought up in Meditation 1, I don't think this argument does much of any good. It's not even obvious to me that Descartes actually offers an argument here. It's often said that he offers an argument, a second argument in Meditation 5, but it's so bad when considered as an argument that maybe the charitable thing to do is to not call it an argument at all. But if it is an argument, it's of a kind, or the kind of argument it is rather, is an ontological argument for God's existence. The ontological argument is not one that Descartes came up with originally, just like he didn't come up with his peculiar version of the cosmological argument in Meditation 3. The ontological argument goes back around 1,000 years, 600 years for Descartes, to a guy named Saint Anselm of Canterbury. That actually, believe it or not, makes it the newest of the kinds of arguments for God's existence, of the big three kinds of arguments. So let's go to a consideration of that. So we've got Saint Anselm of Canterbury, lived 1033 to 1109. He wrote a book called the Prosologion. There are actually two arguments for God's existence, both of which can be or have been called ontological arguments for God's existence, found in that book. It's not actually clear Anselm realized he gave two different arguments, but I'm going to be presenting you with both of them and not telling you about Descartes. The reason I do that is the argument in Meditation 3, given that it's a kind of cosmological argument, it's an argument about the origins of the things we know exist, is a really bad kind of argument for Descartes to pick, to use in that skeptical scenario where the only thing he's sure of is that he and the items of his mind exist. But the ontological argument is exactly the kind of argument you'd want to pick there. So I'm going to cover both of the kinds of arguments that Anselm put forward. I know of no one, like literally no one, in the history of philosophy, in the history of scholarship on Descartes, who actually thinks that Descartes' version of the ontological argument is better than Anselm's. So we're just going to go with Anselm's, and then we'll move on to Meditation 6. Okay. Because we're not actually working from the text of Anselm, this can actually go a little quicker than it normally would. So I'm just going to tell you what the premises of the argument are. Premise number one, God is the greatest conceivable thing. I've misspelled conceivable there. Switch the I and the E. Oh well. This is just supposed to be true by definition. It's supposed to be a definition of the word God. The idea is anything that you're putting forward as a candidate to be God would have to be the greatest conceivable thing, right? Like if someone said, oh, I know that God exists. God is that guy Larry down the road, right? He's a homeless guy. He's got the sign. It says, he wears that sign that says the end is nigh, right? That's God. You're like, no, like I believe that Larry exists, but that's not God. Right? In order to be able to say that, in order to be able to say that, like, well, that thing is not God, you'd have to have some kind of definition of God, some standards that something would have to meet to count as God. And the idea here is that God is the greatest conceivable thing. For anything to be God, it would have to meet that standard. Okay. Now you might get suspicious, right? You might get suspicious about the word is. Like God is? Are you saying that God exists? Are you saying the greatest conceivable thing exists? Well, no, not yet. I mean this in the same way you would mean unicorn. A unicorn is a horse with a horn, right? I'm not committing myself to believing in unicorns by saying that. All I'm saying is that for something to be a unicorn, it has to have those features. It has to have the feature of being a horse and having a single horn coming right out its forehead. Premise two If you understand the word God, then God exists in your understanding. This is just an assumption that Anselm makes. It's an assumption about what it means when we talk about understanding something, understanding a sentence, understanding a word, understanding an idea. The thought here is that when you understand something, that thing exists in your understanding, in your mind. We'll come back to premise 2 when evaluating, but on the surface, it doesn't seem so bad. The idea is even an atheist would accept this. An atheist would accept, okay, well, yeah, I've got God in my head, right? But that doesn't mean God really exists outside of my own mind, right? The atheist's position is precisely that. God only exists in the mind. Right? So Anselm thought, well, atheist is going to accept both 1 and 2. 3, if something exists in your understanding, then you can conceive of it, I misspelled conceive again, existing in reality. This just means that when you're thinking about something, you're thinking about it as though it's real. Like if I ask you to think about a unicorn, you're thinking about what it would be like for the unicorn to really exist. Now, unicorns don't exist, but when you have the idea of a unicorn in your head, you're thinking about what it would be for it to exist. Premises 2 and 3 are just supposed to be claims about what it is to understand something, right? What it is to think about something. It means that you have something in your mind, and what that thing in your mind is your thoughts about what it would be like for that thing to be real. 4, so God can be conceived of as existing in reality. God's existing in reality is conceivable. And hey, I spelled conceive correctly this time. That's supposed to follow from 1 through 3. The idea is if you accept the definition, God is the greatest conceivable thing, then that means you understand the word God. So God's in your understanding. And if God's in your understanding, then you can conceive of God existing in reality. Next premise. It is greater to exist in reality than in the understanding alone. This is just the claim that things that are real are better than things that are not real. I'll come back to that again in a minute too. But on the surface, it doesn't seem entirely absurd. It seems plausible. If I offer you a meal and I say you can have it either in reality or in your head, right? You're like, well, in reality, please. Doesn't do me much good in my head. I want the real thing, not the idea of the real thing. What Anselm thinks is that if you grant him these 5 premises, game over. He can prove that God exists. How? How can you prove God exists from these kinds of premises? I mean, nothing has been said about anything except for what it is to understand something, what the meaning of the word God is, and that it's better to be real than fake, or real than imaginary, or real than merely possible or mental, right? Anselm thinks he can do it, and he thinks he can do it with a kind of argument called a reductio ad absurdum. All right, so what's a reductio ad absurdum argument? Well, reductio ad absurdum is Latin for reduce to a contradiction. Very commonly, we will often say reduce to an absurdity, because in English, the word absurdity doesn't actually mean contradiction. But the basic idea here is with reductio ad absurdum, you start with your opponent's position. And you show that your opponent's position implies some other claim. So your opponent's position is X, X implies Y. Then you show that Y is absurd. Traditionally, what that meant was showing that Y is equal to some contradiction. Right? So P and not P. Because if it's a contradiction, then it must be false. And if it's false, if Y is false, right? So if we can know that not Y, that's what the little tilde means, then we can deduce that not X. You can show that your opponent's position is wrong by deriving from it another claim which you can show to be false, usually by showing it's a contradiction. That's the style of argument. The general problem with this style of argument, and it's not that there's anything wrong with this style of argument, it's just that where you will tend to encounter difficulty with this argument is usually X won't imply Y by itself. So actually what it will be is like X, A, and B together imply Y, right? And then let's say you show that Y is a contradiction, so you show that Y is false. If you then try to go back and say, so you see, X must be false, the person who supports X will just say, no, 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 no. The problem was with either A or B, or both of them, not with my position X. So typically you have to have these auxiliary premises, that's what A and B are, that are very difficult to deny. That's the way to do a reductio ad absurdum. So in a reductio ad absurdum, you're making an initial assumption, which is your opponent's position, because you intend to show that assumption to be false by deriving from it a false, probably contradictory conclusion. All right, so how does Anselm use the reductio ad absurdum style of argument to prove that God exists from these premises? Right? Well, what he starts with is the assumption of his opponent's position, and I'm going to change the color to purple in order to make clear where we are working under the assumption of the opponent's position. So we say the atheist's position, according to Anselm, is God exists only in the understanding. So God exists in the understanding, but does not exist in reality. That, Anselm thinks, is the atheist's position. Now, it is open to an atheist to even deny this. Right? There are some atheists who have said the concept of God is incoherent, and thus that the word God doesn't actually refer to anything, or like you can't even really define the word God, rather, because in any attempt to define it, you come up with an incoherent definition. There's lots of interesting stuff to explore there. You can explore it in a philosophy of religion class, but we're not gonna go into that with this video. So if God exists only in the understanding, that means that you have, here I'm gonna do most of this argument without writing down premises. That means the atheist admits the existence of God in the understanding, which we'll call G-I-U. Now, because God exists in the understanding, according to 4, or actually according to 3, right? God can be conceived of as existing in reality, right? So God in the understanding really exists. God in reality can be conceived of, right? God in reality is conceivable given that God in the understanding exists. Right? That follows from 6 and 3 together. So really I could have put 4 farther down in the argument, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so now that we have these two things, which would be two different things, there's God in the understanding and God in reality. The atheist's position is that God in the understanding exists, but God in reality does not. But look at premise 5 of the argument. It is greater to exist in reality than to exist in the understanding. What that means is God in reality is greater than God in the understanding. When you think about God in reality, you're thinking about or conceiving of something greater than God in the understanding. But that's a problem. Why? Well, because God is the greatest conceivable thing. So if God is the greatest conceivable thing, then God in reality can't be God. Right? And so God in reality can't be greater than God in the understanding. Right? Or maybe the way to put it is this: God merely in the understanding is not as good as a God who is both in the understanding and in reality. And so because you can conceive of God existing both in the understanding and in reality, as opposed to just God in the understanding, that means you can conceive of something greater than God merely in the understanding, which means it wasn't God in the first place, which means we have a contradiction. You'd be saying God in the understanding is not the greatest conceivable thing, but because God just means the greatest conceivable thing, that means you're saying the greatest conceivable thing in the understanding is not the greatest conceivable thing. And so Anselm thinks he's gotten a contradiction. Right? He has shown that the atheist position, when put together with these premises, the key assumptions being the definition in 1, the assumptions 2, 3, and 5, yields a contradiction. Now, this argument has not convinced many people. Some people will say, well, the reason it's not convincing is that one of these assumptions is wrong. Typically, people go after 5 right? They'll say it doesn't actually make any sense to compare things that are real to things that are just like imaginary, right? Like if I ask you, what's better, a Rolls Royce in your mind or a Fiat in reality, right? You might be like, what am I comparing? I'm comparing a car to an idea. How does that make sense? How do I compare a car to an idea of a car? They're not similar. I mean, they're both cars in some sense, but one is a real car and one is a pretend car, right? How do you compare real things to merely conceived of things? That doesn't make any sense. In which case, it would say, if you thought that way, you would say, well, 5 seems wrong. It's comparing things that are radically different from each other. You can't say that God in reality is better than God in the understanding. They're not the same kind of thing. That might also lead you to doubt number 2, right? Which said that if you understand God, then God exists in your understanding. Well, it doesn't seem like God exists in your understanding. It seems like the idea of God exists in your understanding. If something exists in your understanding, then you can conceive of it as existing in reality. Also, that's number 3, also might be a little problematic, because you might think it's the following thing, right? You've got the idea of God in your head, and then you can conceive of God existing in reality, right? So the idea is you go from God existing in the understanding to conceiving of God existing in reality. But the God you're thinking of is still only in your understanding, right? It's not like you're thinking of a new thing, right? The God that exists in your understanding is what you're thinking God would be like in reality. You haven't actually made God exist in reality. You're just thinking of God existing in reality, which means you're still just thinking of the idea of God. Right? So 2, 3, and 5 have been questioned. 1 has actually been questioned by some people. There are some people who have said, well, maybe God isn't the greatest conceivable thing. Maybe God's just the greatest thing that actually is, right? So maybe there could be something greater than God, like maybe it's possible that there's something greater than God, but there actually isn't. Like if something was really the most powerful, most intelligent, most morally good thing in the universe, and that thing actually created human beings like via evolution or something like that, would you really say it's not God because you can imagine something better in some way? That'd be weird. There are also those who think that the reductio doesn't quite work. That the actual argument I just went through without laying down the premises doesn't work. There's all sorts of problems with this argument. Luckily, it's only the first of the arguments that Anselm put forward. It is, however, by far the most famous of them. In fact, for a very long time, I think like 900 years, no one even realized there was a second argument contained in Anselm's book. The second argument is similar in some ways, but importantly, it avoids all this weird stuff about like God actually existing in your head, which seems weird. Like if God's entirely in my head, then like how did God exist before me? There's all sorts of weird stuff. There's another version of the ontological argument, sometimes called the modal ontological argument. I'll run through that real quickly. All right, so here is the modal ontological argument. Lots of people think Anselm effectively made this argument, maybe without realizing that it was importantly distinct from the other argument I just went through. Some people doubt it, but even if Anselm didn't give it, people have given it since, so we can look at it. It starts out the same way the first one did. God is the greatest conceivable thing. This is supposed to be true by definition. Then it goes a little different. It says necessary existence is greater than contingent existence. This is an assumption similar to premise 5 in the original version, which says it is greater to exist in reality than in the understanding alone. Only now you're not comparing two radically different kinds of things. You're not comparing something that actually exists and something that is just an idea in your head. You're saying take any two things, compare them where you think it has, or anything, and imagine that it exists necessarily, meaning it exists and can't possibly not exist, like it exists no matter what. It is completely immune to non-existence, versus thinking of it as contingently existing, meaning that there are ways the world could be where it either would never have existed, or there's ways the future could turn out where it won't exist. The idea is that something that exists necessarily exists completely independent of anything else. Like no matter what else is true, it's going to exist, right? There's no way the world could change that could make it not exist. Whereas contingent things depend on their existence for other stuff, right? We are all contingent beings. We don't exist unless our parents make certain key decisions. Right? And it has seemed to a lot of people, seems to me, that premise 2 here is a much better premise than premise 5. Right? You're comparing about one and the same thing, 2 different properties that could happen. Just saying one of those properties makes the thing better than if the other property. 3 is supposed to follow from 1 and 2. 4 says anything that can be conceived of is possible. This is a controversial assumption, but it is not at all controversial that someone like Descartes believed it. Descartes basically says he believes it many times in the Meditations. And many people accept this. The idea is just that, well, if I can coherently think about something, then that doesn't mean it's actually real, but it definitely means it could happen. We seem like we implicitly accept this whenever we think about the future, right? Whenever we assign probabilities to the future, whenever we say like, well, this is possible, the basis for our saying that something is possible, that something might happen, is usually just, I can imagine how it could happen. I can conceive of how it could happen. So it seems like 4 at least is plausible. 5, God can be conceived of. Another assumption, one that many people have denied. Like I said, I'm not going to go into that now. That's something you can go into potentially in a philosophy of religion course. There are people who have tried to say that the concept of God is inherently self-contradictory. And I don't actually think any of those attempts work, but people have said it. So it's an idea worth taking seriously. I'm just not going to go forward with it. 6 says God is possible. It's possible that God exists. And that follows from 4 and 5. So we have here 2 key claims. If God exists, then God exists necessarily, and it's possible for God to exist. How do those 2 things together get you to the claim that God actually exists? Well, to explain that, I'm going to explain very briefly the idea of possible worlds. Now, you might have come across an idea like this in physics, specifically the idea that there are many, many different versions of this universe. This usually goes along with something called the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics. The idea is any time you have an event happen where it might have happened a different way, right? Let's say you've got, an electron flying along in some tube, right? You've got a tube here, and the tube branches. You've got an electron flying along this tube, right? And let's say there's a chance it could go down either the top tube or the bottom tube. The idea in the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics says that, well, it's a matter of chance in a sense which one it goes down, but it's not a matter of chance in another sense, because let's say we observe the electron, and here I'll overlay it with red. We observe the electron going down the bottom tube. Oops. Well, what the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics says is, if it was possible for it to go up the top tube, then it actually does go up the top tube. It does both things. What happens is the universe, where it goes up the top tube, just splits off from our universe, where the only difference between our universe and that universe is that in that universe, the electron went up the top tube. Now, over time, that tiny, tiny little change could lead to bigger and bigger changes. It could snowball. But that's the idea from physics. That's a way of getting lots and lots and lots of different versions of our universe out there. Right? Possible worlds, when philosophers talk about them, is similar, but it doesn't rely on this idea that the only way that things can be different is with these quantum mechanical divergences. The idea is just every way the world could be is a possible world. So when you talk about possibility, and also it's important to realize philosophers aren't saying all these possible worlds are real. Some think that, most don't. The idea is just that whenever you say something is possible, you're saying there's a way the world could have turned out. There's a way the world could be where that happened. In the possible world, to call it a possible world is just to say, well, that's not the only fact that would be different, right? Like, let's say we're talking about, I decided at a certain point to go to grad school in philosophy rather than to go to law school. But it seems like it was possible for me to decide to go to law school. So there's some possible world where I go to law school. But it's not like I can just say, oh, I could have gone to law school. Everything else would have been exactly the same. That's not true, right? It might be the case that for me to have decided to go to law school, other things would have had to have been different before I made the decision. Like maybe I would have had to have a few more good experiences in pre-law classes or something like that. Or maybe had some more negative experiences in philosophy classes. But, and there'll definitely be lots of changes afterwards. Right? And the idea just is, well, when you're thinking about possibilities, you need to take account of all the differences that would have had to have happened before something came about, and also all the differences that would have had to have come about as a result of this change, whatever you're talking about. So there's possible worlds. And the idea is there's an infinite number of possible worlds out there, an infinite number of ways the world could be. Presumably, actually, there's a greater than infinite, or at least greater than Aleph 1 infinite. Ways the world can be. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say Aleph 1, just ignore everything I just said. I got into unnecessary detail there. So, why am I talking to you about possible worlds? Well, the idea is this. You've got the actual world. We'll call it A. But you've also got all these little possible worlds out there, right? More than I can draw. Right? Each one of these is a possible world. A way the world could be. To say that an object is possible is just to say there is some possible world at which it exists. So to say that my little brother is possible, I don't actually have a little brother that I know of. I mean, I don't know all the stuff that my dad got up to, but let's say I talk about my possible little brother. That just means there's some possible world where I have a little brother. Let's say it's this one, right? That's the Patrick Mayer's little brother world. Okay, that doesn't commit you to saying there's a little brother in the actual world, though. So, like, how is this supposed to work with God? Well, the idea is that if you go back to premise 3 says if God exists, then God exists necessarily. To say that something exists necessarily is to say that it exists at every possible world, including the actual world. Because, of course, the actual world is a possible world. It's a way the world could work out. You know that for sure because it's the way the world actually did work out. So to say that something is a necessarily existing thing is to say that it exists at all possible worlds, or you could say it exists at none. Right? You could have, presumably, although this is getting into fishy territory here, something that doesn't exist, that's impossible, but if it weren't impossible, it would be necessarily existing. Right? So put it this way, an object moving faster than the speed of light. Let's say, contrary to what a lot of people actually think, that the laws of physics are immutable, right? So that at every possible world, the claim that no object can go faster than the speed of light is, that claim is true, right? That means that you could have something that necessarily doesn't exist. But if it did exist, let's say it would necessarily exist. It either exists at no possible worlds or it exists at all of them. Because you might think, well, the beginning of the universe, if there was going to be an object moving faster than the speed of light, it would happen at the beginning of the universe with the Big Bang and stuff like that. And so it would happen at all these different universes, all these different possible worlds. All right, so there's the idea. A necessarily existing thing is one that exists at all possible worlds. To say that God is possible, and here we'll use yellow for this, we'll use yellow for the God world. Right? To say that God is possible is to say that there's some possible world where God exists, the yellow one. But then God exists in this possible world, and God is a necessarily existing thing. So God exists at this world, but that means God also exists at this world, and this world, and this world, and all the worlds. The idea is, if God is a necessarily, if it's part of the definition of God, that God exists necessarily, which is what premise 3 says. Right? Premise 1, which is the statement of God, the definition of God. Premise 2, which is a claim about necessary existence being greater than contingent existence, implies that if God exists at any possible world, then God exists necessarily, meaning God exists at all possible worlds. And so, if you combine that with God is possible, then that means God exists at every possible world, including this one. And that just follows from the definition of God, along with some claims that are supposed to be uncontroversial about the nature of existence, the nature of possibility, and facts about what you can conceive of. Right? You've got a fact about what you're capable of conceiving of here in 5. And keep in mind, since we're talking about this in the context of Descartes, this is something that Descartes thinks he can know. He thinks he can know for sure that he's conceived of something. A claim like 4, Descartes actually believes. And further, he would probably just say it's a clear and distinct perception that it's true. 1 is about the content of the concept of God. And that, again, is something that Descartes thinks he's in a position to know, even if he's in one of these skeptical scenarios. Like if there's an evil demon trying to trick him. The evil demon can't make it true that Descartes thinks he has an idea of God, but doesn't actually. And 2, necessary existence is greater than contingent existence. This is, again, something Descartes would probably claim he knows by intuition, knows by clear and distinct perception, or vivid and clear perception, as in the translation that I believe you're using. So there's an argument for God's existence that doesn't appeal to anything other than the stuff that Descartes thinks he's in the position to know. It is better than the argument for God's existence in Meditation 5. It is, many people think, the best argument for God that exists, this modal version of the ontological argument. There are still ways to avoid it. Like most atheists, when you give this argument to them, they'll say, okay, I've changed my mind. I now deny 5. Easy enough. What most people seem, not everybody, because there is a dispute about the logical principles being used here. But what a lot of people think is this argument shows that either God is impossible or God exists, that there's no in between. And the idea is supposed to be that, well, what reason do you have to think that God isn't possible? That seems like a tough position to hold. So this argument is sometimes taken to just show that the atheist can't say God could exist but doesn't. I do want to make you aware, although I won't go into it in any depth, that move of saying that if God exists at this world and God is a necessarily existing thing, then God has to exist at all the worlds. I just drew a circle that somehow didn't include all my possible worlds in it. Good job, me. That appeals to a logical inference principle that might be false, that some people have claimed is false, or not valid, rather. If you wanted to find out more about that, you could take a class on modal logic. It's a pretty advanced field. You usually should need to take like a symbolic logic class before you do that, but there it is. This has been me covering the ontological argument in place of Meditation 5 and the argument contained there, because I think it's better, and because it doesn't appeal to any claims that Descartes is not in a position to know, given that he's still worried about those skeptical scenarios back from Meditation 1. All right, the last video will be on Meditation 6.